This is Gray Matter, where we process the gray areas of culture. I'm Kaitlin Puccio, and today is the first of two episodes on the brain. This week I'm talking about psilocybin and existential distress, nice and light. Next week I'll be talking about trauma, memory, and identity. So, psilocybin. After psychedelic drug use exploded in the 1960s, Nixon approved the Controlled Substances Act, which made the use of these drugs illegal. At this time, and for decades after until the early 2000s, research on psychedelics was effectively halted. But by 2017, at around the same time that researchers developed new brain stimulation technology to treat certain individuals with mental disorders, psychedelic research re-emerged. So with the arrival of the new biotechnology and a renewed focus on psychedelics, 2017 was a turning point for neuroscientists and psychiatrists in the development of trauma treatments. Since then, psychedelic research has made its way into the mainstream conversation by virtue of its ubiquity. And it really is everywhere. In 105 registered clinical trials surrounding psychedelics conducted from 2007 to 2020, 77.1% of studies commenced in 2017 or later. So, psilocybin, which is the active compound in mushrooms, seems to work by reducing the effect of memory on perception. Most of what we perceive or see in the world is memory. If we look at a tree, the tree's not a new concept, right? It's a tree. We can't not see that it's a tree. The concept of tree is a memory that automatically attaches to the tree that we see. Psychedelics, in part, remove this memory from perception, the memory being an inhibition to pure perception, so that an individual is left in a complex world with no pre-existing concepts or memories to cloud the pure perception of that world. MDMA, also a psychedelic, seems to work a little bit differently, which is maybe why it's not considered a classic psychedelic. So MDMA seems to blunt the automatic, memorized, as in concept memory, reaction to a perceived traumatic event rather than remove the memory from the concepts that make up that event. With MDMA, the concepts or memories remain intact, which means that MDMA treatment for PTSD works more like brain stimulation treatment. So with brain stimulation technology, by keeping the memory intact but extinguishing an overactive fear response in a patient with PTSD, the individual maintains a complete narrative history but is able to function normally without having overwhelming panic responses to triggers. So when developing brain stimulation technology, researchers exposed mice to a high-pitched sound and a low-pitched sound, neither of which resulted in a fear response. They then administered a mild shock to the mice alongside the high-pitched sound. When the mice were then again exposed to the high-pitched sound with no accompanying shock, they exhibited freezing behavior, which is a fear response common in prey animals who play dead as a kind of last-ditch attempt to escape a predator by whom they've otherwise been overcome. The researchers then erased the fear memory by weakening the synaptic connection between the sensory cue, the high-pitched tone, and the traumatic event, which was the shock. So fear responses in general developed as a survival technique in response to dangerous situations, but fear responses sometimes are debilitating. For example, in humans, a war veteran with PTSD may have an overactive fear response to the sound of a car backfiring, which may trigger memories of gunfire. Brain stimulation technology in humans would weaken the connection between the nerve cells involved in forming that memory, resulting in a normalized response to the auditory signal. Psilocybin, as a treatment for mental disorders like PTSD, has become far more widely recognized in the general public than brain stimulation technology, maybe because it seems to be a more natural and likely accessible, both financially and logistically, approach to treatment. Countless studies have shown that psilocybin can alleviate existential distress in terminal cancer patients and those suffering from PTSD. And a single psilocybin treatment has a high success rate of producing a long-term positive change in the emotional state of those struggling with clinical depression. It also tends to be very well tolerated and has really no significant side effects, which is not the case necessarily with conventional treatments like synthetic chemical antidepressant medications, which have been shown repeatedly to be ineffective in a large number of cases. Not all cases, but in a large number of cases. And they can have adverse side effects. And they're also a long-term treatment that leaves individuals vulnerable to relapse. So before the COVID-19 pandemic in 2019, 1 in 8 Americans were taking SSRIs. Yes, there's debate about whether or not these drugs are overprescribed. That argument stems from the idea that SSRIs don't in fact work in a majority of cases. Maybe they are overprescribed in this sense because there's no other available treatment to attempt. Also, in 2019, 6 million people were reported to have been taking SSRIs for a decade or more. But it seems that an effective treatment for clinical depression, regardless of severity, would not be one that patients depend upon for decades or more, but one that actually helps them make a permanent change. Brain stimulation technology may arrive at this outcome, but psilocybin works differently on the brain, and it may be viewed as preferable by patients that are more willing to allow their mind to be opened by lifting the inhibition or the memory that clouds pure perception, rather than suppressing a learned reaction to that memory and keeping the inhibition, the memory, intact. But the stigmatization and the illegality of psychedelics in the 1960s left individuals who could have benefited from psilocybin without access to an effective treatment for decades. And today, government regulators continue to operate on legal inertia. If PTSD and clinical depression, whether from a terminal illness diagnosis or otherwise, could be treated with a single psilocybin experience, any regulatory delay in making it available to patients, whether due to leftover stigma or outdated law, is unconscionable.